But I did want to say something serious because I'm me. And so I have a few remarks about something. And let me start in the most exciting way possible to read you part of a bill proposed in our United States House of Representatives. This is H.R. 1135, introduced by Mr. Jordan of Ohio, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mr. Garrett of New Jersey, Mr. Burton of Indiana, and Mr. Gomert of Texas. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in here, but there's nothing more interesting than paragraph number 3, which is entitled, "With Amazing Straightforwardness and the Kind of Gall that would make a cat burglar flinch." Quote, "Striking workers ineligible. Notwithstanding any other provision of law, no member of a family unit shall participate in the food stamp program at any time that any able-bodied, work-eligible adult of such household is on strike, as defined in the Labor Management Relations Act, 1947, 29 U.S.C. 142.2. Howdy, ILR students. No member of a family unit shall participate in the food stamp program at any time that any able-bodied, work-eligible adult of such household is on strike, as defined in the Labor Management Relations Act, 1947, 29 U.S.C. 142.2, because of a labor dispute other than a strike as defined in Section 2 of the National Labor Relations Board." We should all be on the verge of passing out hearing this. Not even hidden in flowery language in that part of that bill is a Republican measure that if it is passed by the House and somehow by the Senate, that's not likely, but it could happen. Dumber things happen. Weekly. If then somehow it got past the President, or they forged a signature on it or something, this bill would, even more simply put than it is in the language of the bill, it would deny food stamps to any American worker, public or private, who was to go on strike. And it actually gets worse than this. Let me quote again from H.R. 1135. If a worker, it's not the quote yet, but if a worker is already so abused and is battered by our economic system and so failed by education or by industrialization or by international corporations or by outsourcing or by the greed of Wall Street or by Bernie Madoff with a million other Bernie Madoffs we haven't identified yet, or even, we'll throw a bone with conservative paranoia of the weak club, even if they've been failed because illegal, alien, terrorist, atheist, anarchist, liberal, socialist, fascist, communist immigrants have come in and taken all those good jobs, like cleaning the deep fryer at McDonald's or the horse stalls at Lou Dobbs' daughter's favorite horse and country club. If an American, one of us, is so failed by some part of the system that he is already on food stamps, and there are 42 million of us on food stamps at the moment, when a strike occurs, these congressional Republicans will not go all Ebenezer Scrooge on their ass. They will not actually take those food stamps away. However, 1135 again, food stamps will continue, quote, if the household was eligible immediately prior to such strike. However, such family unit shall not receive an increased allotment as a result of a decrease in the income of the striking member or members of the household. In short, if you want to go on strike, whether it's over unsafe working conditions, or subsistence wages, or forced unpaid overtime, or any of 1,000 other abuses, great. Prepare to starve as well. This is where we are today, in the greatest nation on earth, in the period in its history of its greatest wealth, at a time that would make some of the robber barons of the 19th century think about turning themselves in. We are threatening every low-income American for whom the safety net is already far too small and far too frayed, with a choice of their legal right to strike or their moral right to eat food instead of cardboard. Mr. Jordan of Ohio, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mr. Garrett of New Jersey, Mr. Burton of Indiana, who I thought was dead, and Mr. Gomert of Texas. Louis Gomert. You remember him? He's the one who believed that there are pregnant women immigrating here illegally so their babies would then have to become citizens, and 18 or whatever years from now, they'll be trained to become suicide bombers after 18 years of video games and the American educational system. Well, maybe in Texas, okay, it's a possibility. But this is, Gomert is the terror babies moron. who got this idea from, a comic book or something. He has now signed on to a bill that would bring a kind of medieval climax to 2 months of most cops and strike breakers did all the rioting. Or perhaps this is the most concentrated attack on organized labor in this country since the Haymarket bombing in 1886, when a bomb was thrown into a crowd at a union rally in Chicago, and 7 so-called anarchists were sentenced to death for having written something, pro-union works, that might have inspired whoever actually threw the bomb to throw it, because they never found out who threw the bomb. So they got the guys who must have inspired it, and 6 of them were hanged. The other one blew his head off. Don't mistake me, I'm not a supporter of bombs. I don't think the union is right every time, and I don't think every strike is to the benefit of the members of the union. But the strike is inherently dangerous to the rich and to the corporations who have brought this country culturally to its knees. Because it is almost the only defense that ordinary citizens have. It is perhaps the greatest progressive act, and it is indeed the greatest progress in this nation since the emancipation of slaves, or at least it's tied with votes for women. It's that important in my mind. It's a cornerstone. It is the only thing that tilts back the playing field from the natural condition in this country that favors the corporations. It's natural since a clerk in the Supreme Court in the 19th century actually definitely declared that corporations were people, and natural since a jerk in the Supreme Court named Scalia helped declare that those corporate people could spend whatever the hell they wanted on political advertising, because you can't deny our corporate citizens their First Amendment rights, merely because the First Amendment was clearly written to protect individual breathing human beings and not artificial entities created by lawyers who are billing at $1,000 an hour. Thus, 21st century America goes after the unions. Well, you know about Wisconsin, and you know about this Governor Scott Walker, the kind of sad-looking, overmatched goofball who was clearly underinformed about what would happen to him when he became the henchman for the corporations and the almost religious zealotry of the Koch brothers and their un-American ilk. But you may not know about Mr. Carlos F. Lamb. That's not L-A-M-B as in ba-ba-ba, that's L-A-M as in on the. Mr. Lamb is now sort of on the. Actually, he was the deputy prosecutor for the state of Indiana and a big fan of Governor Walker. And Governor Walker really is turning out to be overmatched. But back to his friend Lamb for a moment. What's his pen pal? Mr. Lamb, on the 19th of February of this year, decided to send Governor Walker a little suggestion. I'll read it to you. It was an email. From Carlos Lamb to Governor Scott Walker. Subject, stay strong. Dear God, Walker, this Hoosier public employee is asking that you stay strong and not cave to the union demands. The way that government works has to change, and by all appearances, that must begin in WA. Use the abbreviation, WI. We cannot have the public unions hold the taxpayer hostage with their outrageous demands. Living wage, collective bargaining rights, food stamps, edible stamps, something. But again, I digress. The rest of the email. As an aside, I've been involved in GOP politics here in Indiana for 18 years. No kidding. And I think the situation in Wood presents a good opportunity for what's called a false flag operation. Never write something like this down. That you could employ an associate who pretends to be sympathetic to the union's cause to physically attack you, parenthesis, or even use a firearm against you. You could discredit the public unions. Genius, I tell you. Let me read that part again. You could employ an associate who pretends to be sympathetic to the union's cause to physically attack you or even use a firearm against you. Mr. Lamb does not suggest anywhere in this email where on the body Mr. Walker should get himself shot. My suggestion is that he should not use the foot because the governor seems perfectly capable of doing that to himself anyway. Currently, the media is painting the union protest as a democratic uprising and failing to mention the role of the DNC and umbrella union organizations in the protest. Those damn umbrella union organizers, umbrella makers around the world are screwing things up. To resume the quotation, employing a false flag operation would assist in undercutting any support that the media may be creating in favor of the unions. God bless Carlos F. Lamb. All right, what kind of name is Carlos F. Lamb? Anyway, that's the message, Gov. Try to get yourself shot. Take one for the team. That'll show those bastards who are willing to work for the people, to work for state government. It'll show them that they don't deserve the same kind of rights and collective bargaining that is afforded to almost all private employees. That'll teach them to volunteer for public service. Confronted with this email, Mr. Lamb first explained that he had not written it, that he was out shopping for a minivan with his family at the time stamped on the email. Later, as the fine folks over at the help desk traced the email to his town, then to his neighborhood, and then to his street, Mr. Lamb said that clearly his email account had been hacked. Again, insomuch as it had been hacked previously, and he was damn sure that those bastards had done it again, which did not explain why he didn't, get a different email account. Having run out of stories about this, and apparently I'm willing to say that the family dog was very bright, and might possibly have written the email as a joke, Mr. Lamb finally called his boss at 5 o'clock in the morning one day last week and said, "Yeah, I wrote it. I think I should resign." And his boss said yes. Now, Governor Walker is not responsible for crazy emails from gun-hacking nut jobs in the Hoosier State. The problem for him arises, however, when you remember that this is not the only time that the prospect of what Mr. Lamb so aptly called a false flag operation was raised to the governor. 3 days after that email, a blogger called this very gullible governor and posed as one of the Koch brothers. David Koch, a huge donor to the Walker campaign, and he suggested in a far-reaching conversation that was entirely recorded, that the next time the Capitol in Madison filled up with a pro-union rabble, Mr. Walker should plant troublemakers in the crowd so that there'd be violence that could be blamed on the Democrats and the unions, and Rush Limbaugh would get to breathe heavy on the radio the next day and talk about liberating American workers from safety regulations and food. And that's when Governor Walker committed political suicide, February 22nd. Quote, "Well, the only problem with that, because we thought about that, my only fear would be is if there was a ruckus caused, is that would scare the public into thinking maybe the governor's got to settle to avoid all these problems." So, let's review this. False flag operation, no problem. Get thugs to beat up somebody in the crowd who's actually on your side of the equation, no problem. Use state resources to arrange such atrocities, no problem. The possibility that the reaction would be, my God, what is happening in this country? The governor has to compromise on the union stuff. That was the problem. The good news in all this is pretty simple. In just under 3 months in office, Governor Walker has managed to turn a 5 or 6 point favorable margin into a 5 or 6 point unfavorable margin because he forgot that there are also Republican union members. It's a base irony, but it's worth a laugh. Because once again, the strongest defense of our staples of our democracy turns out not to be vigilance, nor intrepid reporting, nor dedicated public service, but the stupidity of conservatives, who will never settle for just 2/3 of everything. The whole premise of being Republican at this point in the devolution of that party is the awful thought that somewhere in the middle of the night, some poor person has $1 that some rich person actually deserves. We're forced to. And they will keep doing it only because we keep forcing them to do it. And if the obviousness of that is not plain to you, if a governor contemplating getting people on his own side beaten up by plants, or not calling a news conference to say, some idiot from Indiana just said I should get myself shot by a friend and blame it on the unions, if that does not make his point, or the bill to deny food stamps to you if you go on strike and your family does not have enough to survive, if the obviousness of that is not plain enough to you, consider what last Friday was. Last Friday, a century since the Triangle Waste Company fire on Washington Square in New York City, my hometown. ILR has a wonderful, honorable website to this nightmare, and if you don't know the story, I urge you to go look at it. In brief, this is as much as any of us can stand to hear. On March 25th, 1911, 168 mostly young workers, many of them as young as 15, 14, died in an underwear factory in Manhattan, horribly crushed or suffocated or burned to death at the doors of their sweatshop. or because they crashed to the street after they jumped, or they fell from the windows on the 9th floor at a time when the fire ladders only went to get to the 6th floor. Mostly young women. When they jumped, mostly their hair or their clothing was on fire, jumping to their deaths. This was the birth of the real American labor movement about right and wrong in this country. But the true nightmare of it is that the reason they all died was not because of this fire, but because the doors to their work floor had been locked from the outside. And the reason they had been locked from the outside was that the owners did not want union organizers to sneak in and convince them to join the union. Strike or eat, strike or live. Your choices, 1911 to 2011. And don't tell me that it can't go back to being that bad. Because after the parades and the mourning of 100 years ago, and the new legislation that followed in the New York State Legislature, this is the last time it actually worked well. After the legislation that followed, this torrent of tears, 100 years ago right now, the owners of Triangle Waste opened a new factory in New York. And on the 20th of August, 1913, a year and a half after they killed 168 Americans just to keep them from joining the union, those owners were convicted of going to the doors of their new factory floor and locking them from the outside to make sure that union organizers did not sneak in and try to convince the girls to join the union. Again, they were fined $25. Fortunately, the law changed. They were put out of business. But they went right back to doing what they had done, even though it had killed 168 people. The march of this nation has been from the day of its founding inexorably towards progress. We are not a center-right country. We are not leftist. We are not conservative. We're not socialist. We're not Christian. We're not Muslim. We're not Jewish. We're not Protestant. We are a progressive nation in the literal sense of the word. From any point in the past to any point of our society now, we can look with pride at what we have done in this big picture to increase the happiness and the health and the welfare and the safety of the largest number of Americans the quickest we could do it. But this does not come without vigilance. The Triangle Waste Company is alive and well and living in the dreams of the Koch brothers and Carlos F. Lamb and Governor Scott Walker and Ann Coulter. Ann goddamn Coulter. So let us make sure that that is exactly where they stay. In their dreams.